hello everyone, and a really warm welcome to what is our third session of the Create HDR series for this year. My name's Sue Orlovich, and it's a real pleasure to be hosting the session today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which I work and learn today. I'm on the land of the Darawal people and pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. And I particularly recognise and celebrate the artistic practices of storytelling, dance, music, and visual art that Indigenous peoples have engaged in for millennia. I acknowledge how these practices sustain communities, they validate experiences, nurture relationships, and serve as essential forms of cultural continuity for First Nations. And finally, I extend deep respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues who are here with us today or watching the recording. And I invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat, and you might like to acknowledge the land upon which you're joining us from today. So as many of you know, our sessions begin with a presentation from a colleague in the field of arts research, and we follow this by a chance to ask questions and share our wonderings. So as Terry's presenting today, you might have some curiosities or questions arise. Feel free to pop them in the chat as they come to mind, and they can be the basis for our discussion after the presentation. So it's an absolute pleasure to introduce Terri. Terri Elliot is a PhD student at the School of Education at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. And prior to moving to Melbourne at the beginning of the year, she worked as a lecturer at the Centre for Theatre, Dance and Performance Studies and at the School of Education at the University of Cape Town. Her interests are in applied theatre and drama education. And as part of her role at UCT, Terri was engaged in academic support and was part of the team that won the Collaborative Education Practice Award. She's also developed the Global Audience Local Perspective Project, known as GALP, in collaboration with Cardiff Metropolitan University. Terri's actively involved in education and has sat on several education committees, as well as co-authored a series of creative arts textbooks. She's currently focusing on completing her PhD and learning about the delights of life in Melbourne. You've had a busy year, haven't you, Terri?
Been very busy.
Yeah, so we're so thrilled that you're presenting today's session, and Terri's going to introduce the research that's currently being conducted for her PhD, the recontextualisation of the Grade 10 Dramatic Arts curriculum in 3 Cape Town high schools. And she'll focus on contextualising the South African education system in regard to the differential distribution of knowledge in classrooms. And against this backdrop, 3 Grade 10 drama classrooms will be used to consider the various ways in which the drama curriculum is pedagogized and recontextualized. That's quite a mouthful. As part of her research, a framework for the analysis of drama knowledge is in development and will be used to motivate the approach used in classifying teaching selections across the 3 classrooms. Terri, we're so thrilled that you're able to present for us today. So I'll hand over to you now to present your session.
Thank you so much, Sue. It really is such a huge pleasure to be able to do this. Thank you for the opportunity. So looking at, because the PhD is not finished, I didn't want to use the PhD title for the presentation. So I've called it Navigating the Distribution of Drama Knowledge in South African High Schools. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which I work and learn today, the Wurundjeri people, and recognize their continuing connection to land, water, and culture. I pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. And as someone who is very, very much a visitor in this country, I'm endlessly grateful for the opportunity to be able to be on this land. So thank you for that. And hello to everyone. What a pleasure to be able to share this time with you all. I'm going to check that I don't go over 40 minutes, which is not likely, but let me just see the time. Okay, so in trying to work out how to frame and present the presentation, I used to attend the Create webinars last year and the year before, as Sue said, and I went back and rewatched some of them, and I watched Zoe Hogan's beautiful presentation from last month, and I saw that she also said about grappling with this idea of speaking about yourself, and I feel the same way. It's like you don't want to sit and speak about yourself, But for an emerging researchers program, and I'm very much an emerging researcher, I think there is an importance in speaking a bit about yourself and your journey and how you've got there, because we're still in a place of trying to find our identity in this great world of research. So what I decided I would do is I'd speak a bit about, so run the parallels where I was and what my journey was, and how there were some key theoretical influences that were shaping what I was going through. And then look specifically at the process of data collection and how I developed frameworks or tools to process my data, because that's about where I'm at the moment. So I can't tell you more than that because we're not past that. So my journey to the PhD started with, I firmly believe that life led me to education. And I say that because when I was in undergrad, I was studying drama and psychology, and I was going to be either a drama therapist or obviously I was going to be a star as well. And I had all these fantastical dreams. And my friends across various circles of friends kept saying to me, have you considered being a drama teacher? It looks like it would be a really good career fit for you. And every time I gave the exact same response. I said, I would rather lick the hot, dry tar road clean with my bare, naked tongue than become a teacher. Those who can do, those who can't teach. I will never be a teacher. But as life is wont to do, every time I say I will never do something, life throws it across my path. And it's why I also say I will never win the lottery. And I ended up becoming a drama teacher. And how it happened is that I was doing a master's degree in essentially applied theatre. The course was called Educational Drama Theatre. So for someone who didn't want to be a teacher, I was spending a lot of time in schools doing process drama or drama-based pedagogy or theatre in education. And it came to having to write my thesis, and I had to get a case study, and I needed a school. And out of the blue, I got a phone call from a school on the other side of the country saying, would you like to come and be our drama teacher? And I'm like, no, hot tar road, never going to be a drama teacher. And I spoke to my supervisor at the time, who was the most wonderful person who's really shaped who I am as a person. And she's like, I think this is a brilliant idea for a number of reasons. So I'm like, okay, she says it's a good idea, let's do it. 1 year, 2 years max, purely for the purpose of getting my master's. And I ended up loving it. I loved it. I loved teaching so much that I stayed for 8 years in that job. And while I was there, I realized that I did have a love and a passion for education, but I wanted to shift to higher education. So in 2015, as naive as the day is long, I started working in a shared post at the University of Cape Town at the then drama department, but now, as Sue said, the Center for Theatre and Dance Performance Studies and the School of Education. And this post positioned me in a way that I really had to grapple with what it means when drama is in education and what it means when education is harnessed in a theatrical or performative way. So I started having to grapple with those nuances and those differences. At the School of Education, my husband always says, what do? You're the drama teacher. So I did the pre-service teacher training for the drama teachers. And at the Center for Theatre, Dance and Performance Studies, I did the applied theatre, the theatre in education, those sorts of things. So I'm just starting teaching. I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm very overwhelmed. I've got university students and they need something taught to them. And I was preparing for my first set of classes, and I watched a YouTube documentary called Some Children Are More Equal Than Others, produced by Stefan Gottfried. I hope I'm doing justice to his surname. And the documentary tries to tug on your emotional strings a little bit, but it gives a really good overview of what's going on in education in South Africa, stuff I hadn't thought about and hadn't been exposed to before. And it introduced me to the reality that in South Africa, there is a bimodal education system. So 2 different education systems running at the same time under the same curriculum, but completely different. And my heart started racing at this idea, this gross injustice that is enacted against people in our country every day in this education system. So what I started learning about, as I really grew a passion for this, and I was like, I want to understand this more. And as I present my findings or my research, I just want to start by saying that at no point, because I'm going to look a little bit at things like social class and background and issues of race in the country. And I do not in any way hold a deficit view. I do not believe that any child is deficit, no matter where they come from, no matter who they are. I do believe that schools and the way in which they are structured position children differently for success. And in that, inequality is enacted in the school system, but it is not about deficit on the part of the child at all. And also in terms of, obviously in South Africa, race is a huge thing. So when I use terms referring to race, there are terms that are appropriate and respectful for the South African context. I know that those don't always translate to different contexts, but they are said from a place of respect for the context in which I'm working. So obviously South Africa went through the atrocities of apartheid and is a colonized country. And the schooling systems established when a country is colonized often leave a distinct imprint on and significantly impact the way in which education continues to be practiced after the country has emerged from colonial oppression. And this is very pertinent in South Africa. And education in South Africa was passed by, so during apartheid, there were a number of acts that were passed, terrible acts like the Mixed Marriages Act. There was a Group Areas Act, and one of the acts was the Bantu Education Act of 1953. And this act was a discriminatory approach to education that left significant consequences on the school system still today. And it sought to put forward different education systems for children from different racial backgrounds, with the idea that white children would be able to access a better quality of education so that they would be positioned to enter into professional work. And children from other racial groups would not have that same level of education, so they would not have the same opportunities to enter into the professional world of work in the same way. There were also differences and discrepancies around funding, resources, and quite significantly around the requirements on teacher training to be able to teach. So teachers had to have more qualifications and be more trained to be able to teach in the white schools, so-called white schools. So this obviously set up a very problematic cycle, because you've got a group of people who are getting a really world-class education that puts them in a position where they can become doctors and dentists and lawyers and whatever else is going to earn you a wonderful salary. And then you've got a whole other group of people who are strategically and systematically being denied access to that knowledge. So when apartheid, after 1994, one of the things that the country did is they looked at the education system, which was, as I've got at the bottom there, during apartheid, it was the native education system, which was a traditional model of education, which was a more performance-based approach to learning. And they moved to an outcomes-based education system post-1994, which is called Curriculum 2005. And this was viewed as being a sort of challenging this education, this system would have been tantamount to challenging democracy. It was like, it's the new education system for the new South Africa. And it was a more progressive approach to education, which was more a competence model of education. But it brought about a whole lot of problems, because suddenly the schools that were, it was not very prescriptive, it was very open. So the schools that had resources, where teachers had been trained, where there was access to libraries and things like that, i.e. the old white schools, so-called white X-Model C schools, were able to fly with it. But the same was not true across the other schools. So it actually ended up creating a whole lot of problems. We then went through another curriculum reform, which went through, and it's actually very complicated, because it happened in different phases of education, had different journeys. So this is a gross overview and gross summary. If anyone is watching this and is doing research, please read up more about it, because it's more complex than this. We went through another curriculum reform, and we ended up with and we shifted back to a more traditional model of education, which is more performance-based, with the idea that having a more sort of a more strongly prescriptive curriculum would actually be more equal and more fair and more democratic. So we went to the National Curriculum Statement, which was then revised as the Revised National Curriculum Statement, and then revised again as CAPS, which is the current curriculum in South Africa. And CAPS stands for the Curriculum and Assessment Policy Statement. So I just went over that to orientate us where we are and why this is still problematic, because we're actually still living under what happened in 1953. So the third reform led to the introduction of a national curriculum and assessment policy statement, which I said, and the move to CAPS saw a decisive shift towards a specialized performance-based curriculum. It saw significant changes, including increased subject specification and the reintroduction of textbooks. So during the curriculum 2005, there weren't prescribed textbooks. It was very open. And the new CAPS curriculum is a very strongly classified and more explicitly stipulated curriculum. So, oh goodness, it's this little bar, then I can't read what I've got on my screen. Let me just move it down quickly. So what has happened is that this hangover from Bantu education is still felt in that approximately, the research varies. Some research says it's sort of 17%, 83%. This research done by Nick Spall, who I trust with all my heart, he's a wonderful researcher, in 2015, points to 25% and 75%. It just depends where you're looking, how you're taking the research. Either way, it's a shocking statistic. So approximately 25% of learners in South Africa, and the phrasing is functional and dysfunctional. I don't like the phrasing dysfunctional, but it is what is being used, go to schools that are termed as functional schools. And these are the ex-Model C schools, or the old white schools from the Bantu education system. While approximately 75% of learners in South Africa attend schools that are classed as being dysfunctional. So you've got 3/4 or possibly even more of the learners in the country not getting an effective experience in education. On one end of the spectrum, in the 25%, we have some of the world's most renowned schools, schools that are extremely expensive, extremely elitist, and sort of spaces of mass privilege. And because, in South Africa, there's some schools that are not a lot of schools, very few schools are no fees or fee-free schools, and then it goes on a sliding scale. So the more you can pay, the closer you'll get to that 25%. But now we've got this thing of people who've been able to get educated, get professional jobs. So these cycles keep going. And while there has been shift, it is still race and class still largely hold hands. And I can't understand why this is not being tackled more in the country, because I'm like, if we can break this, we will break so many other things. Okay, so I've gone through that. Then, oh goodness, there we go. And what else was happening at the same time that I was learning about this idea of bimodal education and what was going on in terms of the history of education is that I just started at UCT in 2015, and in February 2015, the Roads Must Fall protests happened, and which were then closely followed by Fees Must Fall. And because I was in a drama department, and because we had students who were very politically astute and politically aware, and we were in a space where a lot of opportunity for dialogue was created, I was given the opportunity to have conversations that I would not previously have had. I would never have had the chance to have had such real conversations with the students with whom I was working. And through these conversations and witnessing the impact that this generational sort of inequality in education had on the people who were sitting in front of me in my classes, they were living out this legacy. I started to gain more insight into these cycles of privilege and inequality. And I also started to gain insight into the cycles of privilege that had sort of rested over my own life, purely because of the color of my skin. So it was a really transformative time for me in terms of understanding some of the dynamics of our country. And then, sorry, every time I do the arrow, it doesn't want to, there we go. And then in terms of my professional work, at the same time that all of this was going on, because I worked in theatre and education and applied theatre, and I went out to schools and worked with students who were doing their teaching prac, I was spending a lot of time in my workday in different schools across the city and seeing different learners in different learning spaces. And I'd never had that before. I'd gone to the school that I attended and I'd been to the school where I taught. So I didn't really have this rich understanding of schools in the country. And I was starting to see how all sorts of things, space was arranged differently, administration was conducted differently, learners approached things differently, and meaning making happened in really different ways. And I was also able to see, so our theatre and education students would create a piece, and then they would take that piece to a range of different schools. They'd do a mini tour. And I was able to see how that piece, exactly the same piece, landed differently in different contexts and different schools. So really rich, like I was observing this while everything else was going on. And then I had my second significant learning moment. And in 2018, I was invited to audit a master's course at the School of Education. And in this course, I was introduced to the work of Basil Bernstein. And finally, Bernstein seemed to offer a way in which I could take all these thoughts about what was going on in the country and education, and I could hold them in a more theoretically explicit manner. So Bernstein still confuses me. I still feel very out of my depth when I work with Bernstein, but it's been really helpful for me to have these tools to actually name pedagogic discourse and how to name it and how to look at it. And some of the key ideas that I use in my research from Bernstein is the idea of reproduction and interruption, and the idea of recontextualization. So reproduction and interruption, obviously how the school can, it's actually a point further down, but that's fine. How the school is the space where culture and society is either reproduced or interrupted. And in this sense, the school then becomes one of the core spaces in which inequality is either reproduced or interrupted. And that idea of interruption really excited me. I'm like, we do not have to keep copy, paste, repeating. We can actually, through our education, cause interruption. Bernstein also looks at recontextualization, which is what happens to knowledge when it moves from one space to another space, the shifts that happen in knowledge. And then two other key ideas that I haven't got on the slide, but I do need to mention, is the idea of classification and framing. So with classification, this is about control, and it looks at the relations between, so for example, the relations between subjects and the maintenance between knowledge categories and the boundaries. So if, for example, and it's either strong or weak. So if, for example, you've got subjects where you learn just about maths, just about drama, just about language, and those ideas there's no cross-curricular crossover. That's very strongly classified. There's a strong boundary. If there's integration and movement between the subjects, you've got weak classification and those boundaries are more permeable. He also looks at the idea of framing, which has to do with the idea of power. And it's about where classification is about relations between. Framing is about relations within. So it looks at the relationships within those spaces. So for example, between the teacher and the learner, and at how those relations are maintained and who has power in those relations. So if the teacher is making all the decisions and driving everything in the class, the sequencing, the pacing, whatever it may be, that's a strongly framed experience. But if the learner has some agency, that becomes a more weakly framed experience. So Bernstein's theory of the pedagogic device, which looks at distribution, recontextualization, and evaluation, opens up the ways in which these reproductions or interruptions happen at the micro level of pedagogy. So my research is very interested, like one of the main focuses is what is happening as a result of pedagogy and the choices and decisions that the teachers are making about pedagogy and the way that they teach. And I was very interested in understanding how, with a common curriculum, so CAPS, everyone gets the same, so it's a common curriculum, but there is still a differential distribution of knowledge. And this is leading to consistently unequal outcomes in the schooling system in South Africa. So the PhD journey begins, and the scary process of writing a proposal. And the first thing, oh goodness, I've gone one back, sorry. And the first thing you have to do when you're writing a proposal is come up with a title. So we got our PhD title, which was the recontextualization of the grade 10 dramatic arts CAPS in 3 Cape Town high schools. And then you have to come up with your research questions. So my research questions, as they do still stand, are: how is the grade 10 dramatic arts CAPS document recontextualized in 3 schools with learners from different SES backgrounds? What different instructional components are selected by the teachers? How are the regulative contexts of the classrooms different? What pedagogic meanings are enhanced and what pedagogic meanings are restricted in the classroom? And do the forms of knowledge of dramatic arts enable greater differentiation of the context-independent, context-dependent relationship through the integration of theory and practice? So I had that, and suddenly I had a proposal, and everyone's like, good, now you've got to do something with it. And I had to start doing data collection, and I went, oi, now what? So what I did do with my data collection is I went to 3 different schools, which represented a range of different contexts. And in the 3rd term, because I started my PhD in 2020, and I was going to be going into schools, and then that thing happened. So everything was delayed, and I ended up only being able to, I was only approved to go and do field work in schools in the 3rd term of 2021. And I had to do it then. So I was restricted by the choice for what, oh, my words. I was restricted by what I could observe based on what was being taught at that time. In the 3rd term, in the curriculum, there is a choice topic, and there also, not every school offers drama. So there were only a certain number of schools that were geographically realistic for me to go to. The schools had to represent a range of different contexts and backgrounds, and the schools all had to be teaching the same choice topic. My schools chose me. There were 3 schools that popped out that had teachers that agreed to the research. So I found my 3 schools, and I observed. It was exploratory research, so just seeking to see what was happening. I observed a minimum of 8 lessons at each school. At one school, I think I did 10 lessons just to allow the journey to go full cycle. And the lessons covered both theory and practical. So some teachers teach theory and practical very separately, some teach it in a more integrated way, but at all the schools, I saw how the teacher taught both the theoretical and the practical component of the curriculum. I also did learner questionnaires and teacher interviews. And my intention in doing this was to observe the pedagogic choices made by the teachers in teaching a common topic, and to observe the impact that these choices had on the recontextualization of the curriculum into the classroom, and to observe what pedagogic meanings, as I said previously, were enhanced or restricted. I had a lot of data. I had over 30 hours of video footage, and I had no cooking clue what to do. I went into full freeze mode at this point when my data collection was completed. And I felt completely out of my depth. I didn't know what I was doing. I was full of the imposter syndrome. Like, why am I even doing this PhD? And I was paralyzed. I didn't know what to do. And then I had my next learning journey moment where I found out about the work of Graham McPhail. This is now months. The data is just sitting there. And I'm like, I'm going to do something with it. I'm going to do something with it. And I had no clue what I was going to do with it. And then I discovered the work of Graham McPhail. Well, not I discovered. My PhD supervisor, in her beautiful brilliance, pointed me to the work of Graham McPhail, who does work in music education. And McPhail looks at a lot of things, but one of the things that he looks at is the ways in which informal learning is recontextualized in the formal learning space. He also looks at the importance of access to generative concepts, which he defines as being concepts that generate new knowledge. He argues against informal learning sitting informally within the school setting with as little recontextualization as possible. And he believes that deep learning is of importance, which he sees as the ability to see relationships between epistemic parts and wholes of a subject, the ability to think conceptually and abstractly, meaning about ideas and principles may be obtained, and that conceptual meaning is freed from the specific context of informal knowledge, thus enabling it to be generalizable. So in trying to understand this in my own words, because most of the time I'm like, what is going on with this theory? Help it make sense, please. I understand it as knowledge always comes from a specific context. It's always embedded in a context. And that knowledge is then tied to the context. But if you can free the knowledge, if you can make it generalizable, if you can get to the concept that underpins the knowledge, it then becomes usable beyond the context. So it becomes transformative. It becomes, it shifts into the abstract and the conceptual. So MacPhail looks at the idea that we have experiences of knowledge that are informal. If you are watching TV, you are having experiences of elements of drama with the script, with the characters. But those need to be formalized in order for them to be attached to the concept that's underpinning them. It needs to be made explicit for that knowledge to become generalizable, for it to be able to be used beyond the informal knowledge. So he looks at the importance of the school as a place in which knowledge can be, informal knowledge can be explicitly conceptualized. And in his work, as well as his work with Elizabeth Rata, he looks at the idea that epistemic access and access to specialized knowledge is an ethical right and an act of social justice. So this access to the conceptual base is what every learner needs to get to. So the informal knowledge is valuable and it's good, and it shouldn't be separate, but you need to understand what the concept is that holds that informal knowledge. Okay. There we go. So one of the things that he puts forward in his research, and this has become foundational to my research, is he argues that there are three knowledge dimensions: the experiential, the aesthetic, and the epistemic. And he defines the experiential as referring to sensory and corporeal dimensions, which are theorized as being experienced in a predominantly spontaneous way. So this is an experience of the art form where there's no explicit link to the conceptual base. He defines the aesthetic as inviting conscious engagement and reflection in relation to music's intrinsic, music because he's working in music, intrinsic components and effects. And as I was reworking this in the framework for drama, I added that it is the conscious, intentional application of the art form and its use in the crafting of and reflection on either process or product. And I added the process or product there because I was getting myself stuck in boxing things. So I'm like, like the aesthetic is always about the product or whatever it might be, but it's not. The aesthetic can link to the process or the product. It's where the craft is applied. So it's the application of crafting. And then the epistemic is knowledge of and about the collectively developed generating principles, concepts, conventions, and objects of the discipline. And then in trying to make sense of it for drama, I added that it's the specialized modes of critique, description, and argument that are only possible when access to and engagement with generative concepts has occurred. So the experience is about something that has you don't know the conceptual base. If someone teaches you a little thing on the guitar and you know that you go bum 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 bum, you can do that, but you don't understand the concepts about why that works as a song. Aesthetic is then I understand these concepts and I know how to craft them into something. And epistemic is working with the actual knowledge. So these three ideas became really important. So I started thinking about the data, and these are some in-process reflections that I had from the three schools. And there were some trends that emerged based on initial observations. So these are taken directly from my fieldwork journal while I was in the schools. And I said that teacher A used content knowledge to support all practical work. Lessons tended to alternate between theory and practice, where when a concept had been learnt during a lesson, the following lesson would often allow for the practical exploration of the concept. The teacher created strong boundaries between classroom knowledge and everyday knowledge and kept learners on track throughout every lesson. When the learners spoke about anything outside of the content to be covered, the teacher quickly brought them back to the specialized knowledge of the class. The teacher, bearing in mind this is with Commedia dell'arte, I don't know if I mentioned that. That was the topic I was looking at. So all of these teachers are teaching Commedia. The teacher used character definitions as a starting point for modeling for the learners, after which the learners would then engage experientially with understanding the Commedia characters. They did this through using characters from the schools. They had to become like a a principal, a teacher, a student. And in those, so they had an experience of those power dynamics that are evident in Commedia, and then they were applied to the theory. The teacher would refer to the salient points from the character description in order to guide the learners to more accurate physical realizations of the different characters. The pedagogic style relied on a combination of verbal explanation, physical demonstration, and learner embodiment. And then in the second school, Teacher B physically modeled the Commedia characters and then requested the learners to copy her movements. The teacher used Laban to assist in the development of a character's physicality. The learners were required to engage in a form of physical rote learning, so it was very much do exactly as I have done. The links between content and practice were not always adequately established, nor were they always accurate. There was limited evidence of careful linking of the classroom experiences back to the key theoretical concepts, as per CAPS, that underpin topic 9 of term 3, Commedia, for grade 10. The teacher showed a strong degree of compliance with CAPS and other policy documents in regard to framing issues such as sequencing. So she interrupted the flow of lessons in terms of the development of Commedia, because in CAPS it said that there was something that said at a point she had to do something. So in order to be compliant with that, she added that lesson in there rather than holding it over for the end. And then teacher C frequently created space for learners to share their personal stories. The teacher also took part in sharing their own stories. There was a large degree of fluidity and movement between classroom knowledge and everyday experiences in the presentation of the material. The teacher used a rich character description, which they read while the learners responded physically in order to craft the Commedia characters with the class. They did not demonstrate physically, and all physical realization was based on the learners' interpretations of the character description. Learners were invited to create and develop ideas for presentation during class time. And these learners actually had this teacher she was an extremely aesthetic, she was very mindful of crafting, and her learners had some of the strongest realization of performativity. They were very, very skilled performers in the class. Okay, so oh goodness, hold on. So I had all of this and I was still going, now what am I meant to do? And all of this had just given me more things that I was grappling with. I sat there going, it's this tension between knowing how to do something so I can execute a beautiful pantalone and I can do it with real skill. But do I know about what it is that the concepts and the theories and the ideas behind pantalone? I was grappling with theory and practical. So in CAPS, it's a very strange thing. The theory and the practical are presented separately. They're complete, like it says theory, groups, and tells you what to teach. Prac, groups, tells you what to teach. And then in the statement about learning, it speaks about the integration of theory and practice. So the document is has these weird tensions in it. So I was navigating that pool between theory and practice. I was looking at everyday knowledge and school knowledge. I was looking at these 3 analytic dimensions, and it was emerging that each teacher seemed to present knowledge by favoring one of the dimensions. There was one teacher who was working very much in the experiential dimension. One was working very much aesthetically, and one was working very much epistemically. And one thing that I didn't want to do was create a hierarchy of knowledge, because one type of knowledge is not more important or more valuable than another type of knowledge. They just serve different purposes. So I constantly had to remind myself, because I always wanted to go, like, epistemic is good, but so is experiencing the art form, and so is understanding how to craft it. So I was trying to work out how to work with this data in a way that wasn't privileging one type of knowledge. I also didn't want to unintentionally polarize knowledge, because knowledge is much more fluid and dynamic than that. And it's really dangerous to put it on these 2 polarized extremes. So probably at this point, I drank some wine. And then what I did is I used Bernstein and MacPhail to develop 2 analytic tools. So the rest of this presentation, I'm just going to quickly talk through those tools, and I'm doing all right for time. Am I, Sue? Yes, okay, still doing all right. So the first tool draws on Bernstein and is modeled on the work that Hoadley did in 2005. So Hoadley also drawing on Bernstein. So I've taken a set of schemas that she developed, classification and framing schemas, and I've adapted them for my research. So some of them are exactly the same as Holy, some of them are different and adapted for my research. And what these schemas do is they allowed me to code the classification and framing dynamics of the lessons that I was observing. And classification and framing provided language for the description of pedagogic discourse. So this became really useful because suddenly I could describe what the teachers were doing in a way that was not just they asked the learners to stand in a circle or whatever it may have been. I had a tool for describing it. So I'm just giving a quick example. I think it's 23 of these. I promise I'm not going to go through all of them. That would be far too tedious. But for example, I would look at the discursive rule, which would be selection, which is the extent to which teacher and external resources have control in the selection of instructional knowledge. And then I was also looking at how this worked with the curriculum and with the textbook. We have one drama textbook in South Africa. There's no other choice. And it's the Via Africa textbook. So everyone uses the same textbook. So I was also looking at how they were holding hands with each other. And then I'd look at, in each lesson, did the selection of tasks, activities, and knowledge always or almost always, or were they always or almost always determined by CAPS? Ditto the same by the textbook, on a spectrum all the way to they were never or almost never determined by CAPS or the textbook. So then this is just like another example of what they looked like. So I developed a whole set of these. And then what I did is I got a template. Sorry, I've actually cut off. This was very difficult to work out how to put these into the PowerPoint because they get so wordy. So you're not seeing all of it. And then I developed a template, which is the one on the left, which had all of the schemas with the coding that I could then do one of these for each lesson that I observed. And on the right, you can see an example again, half of it's cut off, but what it looks like once I've coded it. And this allowed me to start putting numerical values to things, but also I could start seeing trends. So I could see, is a teacher working in a very strongly and using strong framing? Have they got weak classification? So I started to be able to see what the teachers were doing by using these tables. And then the second thing that I did was I developed an analytic tool that drew on MacPhail, as well as on a range of drama education theorists. So, I mean, John O'Toole, Katie Dawson, Hornbrook, like all of the big guys are in that framework. And I developed something called, well, it's still being developed. Let me not be so bold as to say I developed. I am developing something called the Drama Knowledges Framework, or DKF. And I would share a picture of it, but it's very much my original contribution to knowledge, and it's not yet published. So I'm just going to explain how it works for now. So it's a framework that allows for both a vertical and horizontal classification and coding of drama knowledge, with a focus on understanding when drama knowledge is working in the experiential, aesthetic, or epistemic dimension. The framework acknowledges and allows for the differences between learning in drama, learning through drama, learning about drama, and creates a way in which those different approaches to learning can also be coded. It's used to analyze the data through the application of IAF cycles or units. And what an IAF cycle or unit is an instruction activity feedback cycle. I had such a dead moment when I was preparing this because it is based on someone else's work. And I read through like every one of my PhD documents and I could not find the theorist that I used to base it on. Somewhere out there is a theorist who shaped this. I've changed the name of it. I will find it. So please don't think this is my idea. It was drawn from someone else. And an IAF unit begins with an instruction or explanation, the teacher's pedagogic input, and traces that input through the learner's realization and interpretation of it, so their action, whether that just be the way they answer a question, whatever that action is, to their reflection on it, which is their feedback. In presenting the findings for the research, I've coded all of them, but I'm probably only going to use the instruction parts, the teacher's instruction, because with Bernstein, he argues that that's the thing that is the most that you can code because you can see what the teacher's doing. And then I've had to scratch some things out because this is stuff speaking about real schools. So how I use the DKF to understand pedagogy is I created an analysis sheet that looks at the teacher instruction, the learner activity, the teacher feedback, and I break each lesson down. I mean, most of the lessons have about 30 units, so this is just a little grab of it. I break each lesson down into the IAF units, and then you can look, if you go horizontally, you can see, is the teacher's instruction, so if the teacher's is trying to work in an epistemic way, is that epistemic knowledge coming through in how the learners are realizing knowledge? So you can trace it horizontally, but you can also trace it vertically, which you'll see now. So when you zoom out, again, this isn't a whole one, you can start to see in the lesson the trends. So with the color coding, so you can start to see where the teacher shifts and how they're using aesthetic, epistemic, experiential, or a blend of both of those. So I did that with the drama knowledges framework. And then for each lesson, I created this little table. So where I named the units. So here's a lesson that has 28 units. That's a pretty standard number of IAF cycles. So what they did in each unit, and then you can code the kind of knowledge that's being used in that unit. And then you can get, sorry, let me go back quickly. And then you can get a numerical value. I'm going to explain to you why that's important now. And then after I'd done that, I went to the curriculum. So I'm looking at pedagogy curriculum in the textbook. And again, this is a much longer document. The curriculum is quite a chunky document. So I looked at the drama curriculum broadly. So from grade 10 to grade 12, I created knowledge statements for the curriculum. So what is the intention of what should be learned? So I created a whole lot of these knowledge statements. I then transferred them onto a sheet that you can see on the right, where I could code the type of knowledge that the knowledge statement is seeking to look at, and I could then get a summary of results. So the broad drama curriculum actually allows for some learning through drama, which none of the teachers were doing in their classroom. Not a lot, just 6 counts where you can actually learn through drama. The rest is all learning about drama. When I did this, I was pleasantly surprised that there's a lot of allowance for experiential, but with a strong focus being on epistemic knowledge. And then I went and did the textbook. Oh, no, sorry. Then I went to the curriculum and I did Commedia specifically. So I did that in a lot of detail. I broke it down a lot more finely. Same thing, coded it using the thing, and then went and looked at those numbers. So where you can see in the curriculum more broadly, there's space for learning through and space for experiential. In Commedia, the focus is more on aesthetic and epistemic. So you can start to see those differences. And then I did it for the Via Africa textbook. So same thing, I did a broad sweep of grade 10 to 12. I created the knowledge statements for what had to be learned, coded it, there's like copy, paste, repeat, and then did it in fine detail for Commedia, and then could get those numerical values again. And what this means, why it's been useful, is it's all come to this. For each lesson that I observed, I can now see, so in this lesson, the teacher was working in a very strongly experiential way. She got a score of 14. Whereas for Commedia, so for the curriculum, for Commedia, they're not focusing on experiential learning. And in the textbook, experiential learning is not the focus. So for both the curriculum and the textbook, epistemic access is that's what the learning is about. And the teacher here is only having 13 moments in her IAF cycles where she's finding explicit links to epistemic knowledge. So we'll see. That's where I'm up to. I've still got to write up what these findings are, but the heart behind it all is to hopefully find out something about how drama knowledge is shared in classrooms and how this can maybe be used in some way to address these problems in education in South Africa. So there we go. That's it. I don't know how my time went. I hope I was within time. So thank you all so much. What a real pleasure to have had the opportunity to have done this. Thank you to Sue and to Create and to everyone who shared the time with us. I hope it was a little bit interesting.
Terri, I think you're selling yourself short there. I so enjoyed your presentation, and my mind is actually buzzing with thoughts and wonderings and curiosities, and I know that just from people's responses there, they've so appreciated you sharing your journey, but more than your journey, your moments of deep insight along the way. And feel free, anyone, if you'd like to unmute or to pop a question or a thought or a wondering in the chat. I'm thinking a little bit more about those pivotal times that you talked about during your journey, where they were almost aha moments of sense making, where you came across Bernstein's work and it all of a sudden was a way of deeply understanding what was a sea of ideas and thoughts. And then that the next time where you talked about was it McPhail's
Yeah.
work, and how that then added another layer of coherence, and how those particular frames or lenses led you then to developing the most comprehensive and well-ordered system of coding to understand what was a sea of data. And I just think you described that so well. There were moments of your description that I felt, having gone through the process just recently, I could really relate to. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Sue. That's really generous. Thank you.
And we've got a few comments here. Stephen shared, thank you so much, Terri. That was amazing. Stephen, is there anything that you'd like to wonder, to ask about, to comment upon?
Yeah, no, it takes me ages with this kind of stuff. No, it's amazing. I was there was so much material. I was trying to find parallels to what, that idea. Year 10, you were talking about. I mean, is that 13, 14-year-olds?
Sorry, year 10. Yes, you
Year
are
10.
15 turning 16 in year 10.
Oh, right. Okay. So yeah,
Yeah.
I was just trying to pitch where it was going to be when you were talking about community latte and stuff. And I was thinking, oh gosh, you know what I mean? Because I'm working at the moment with younger children. I'm working in primary at the moment, looking at dance, but it's kind of, there were so many parallels there that it's just amazing to look at how you've taken work that you understand from like a performing basis, and you put, how you're academicizing it, if that makes sense. For me, it's just amazing. Thank you so much. It was just a privilege to listen to your work. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really lovely, kind compliment. Thank you.
I was making some links between what we were talking about at the very beginning when we all jumped online, and Stephen, you were talking about the huge amount of literatures that we swim in, and the ideas that we're exposed to, and the certain times during that exposure where you're wanting to try and synthesize and to make sense and to bring some of the reading that you've been engaging with together. And I think, Terri, you described that so beautifully, how you went about doing that, and how sometimes there were particular points where you almost had to pause and look at, well, actually, what does this all mean, and how do I actually integrate or synthesize where I'm at the moment? And those lenses you talked about were so helpful.
I have very real moments of paralysis on this journey where I have been gobsmacked at how much time I can waste when I'm working on my PhD, because I'm like, I don't know what I'm meant to be doing, so I will make tea. And I still don't know what I'm meant to be doing, so I will do some laundry.
And sometimes those pauses or those silences are the times where that synthesis occurs. That's such an interesting comment. And Jeremy's made a comment in the chat and said, wow, what a body of work. Loved hearing your aha moments, and to explain it so clearly, that's really cool. So some lovely feedback there as well. Terri, we've really appreciated you sharing today, and we'll have to twist your arm to come back when you've actually done your analysis and your findings, and have drawn some conclusions, because we would love to hear the outcome of your research in time to come.
No arm twisting required. It would be such a pleasure, really, truly. I'm so grateful to you and to everyone at Create. It's such a wonderful space to be part of.
Oh, well, it's been really lovely that you've presented, and really wonderful that people have been able to jump online. And I know there'll be many people watching it on the recording as well. So our next session for the year is on the 31st of October at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Sydney Eastern Standard Time. Thomas DeAngelis is going to be presenting his research, and his research is on environmental awareness through applied site-specific theatre. So if you keep your eye out for the advertising around that one, you'll see that in the Create newsletter that comes out, and the same Zoom link will work for access to that one as well. So really looking forward to seeing you all again in a month's time. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon and this morning in Dublin time. And thank you again, Terri. Really appreciated you sharing. It was such a joy to listen to your presentation.
Thank you so, so much. And thank you to everyone for joining. And I can't miss saying thank you to my mom for joining as well.
Thanks, Felicity, for joining. Lovely to have your support as well. Bye for now, everyone.